All right. And let's go ahead and go to present. And there we go. Are we ready to rock onto Electric Avenue, as it were? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. And we sort of made a segue from talking about cells to talking about ecology in our last lecture. Eco, by the way, from Greek oikos, means a household. So ecology is the study of your household, just as economics is, it means the laws of your household or the rules of your household. Although in ecology, of course, the household is the household that we all live in, that's the natural world. So a little different from economics. And the basic thing about ecology is that there's no such thing as a single organism. Nobody lives truly alone. 1 second. Okay. All right. Yuki, konbanwa. Okay. All right, Yuki, how are things?
I'm sleepy.
I know. I'm sorry about the time zones. I would, yeah, I would thank you for joining us. And I would say, I can't remember how you say how are things in Japanese, or I would offer it. But all right, but getting back to the slides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There we go. Ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other. Every living thing is affected by other living things. It could be their food. It could be the living things that eat them, their predators. It could be their diseases, their parasites, their competition. But whatever it is, every species probably has hundreds of other species whose life affects it in some way. And you can study this at different levels of organization. If we're talking about population ecology, a population is just the set of all members of one species in one area. Just as we talk about the human population of Conway, we could talk about the population of coneflower in the UCA Nature Reserve, or we could talk about the population of black bears in the White River Wildlife Management Area in eastern Arkansas. Or we could talk about, I don't know, Casper, we could talk about the population of brown seaweed in the Kattegat, something like that. That's just what a population is. All members of a single species in one area. If you look at a set of interacting populations in one area, we'd call that a community. So we could talk about the plant community of the nature reserve, or the mammal community of eastern Arkansas, or the, I don't know, seaweed community of the Sea of Japan. Whatever it might be. When you start looking at communities together with non-living factors, we can talk about an ecosystem. The word we use for non-living is abiotic, and you'll see that word again. Abiotic means anything that's important in an ecosystem that is not itself alive. So the amount of light, or the temperature, or if we're talking about the oceans, the salinity, the amount of salt in the water, or the wind speed, anything like that would be abiotic. It's not actually living, but it's important for the ecosystem. Someone else has joined us. Morning, Nicole. Good morning. You there? Morning.
Good morning. Sorry I'm late.
Quite all right. Quite all right. I'll go back to the slides if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. Right. I was talking about a population being the set of all members of one species in one area. If you talk about populations of different species that interact, you have a community. If you look at all the communities in one area and consider them together with non-living or abiotic factors like sunlight or um, temperature or water quality, whatever that might be, we have an ecosystem. If you look at a set of similar ecosystems, you'd call that a biome. So, for example, in the nature reserve, we have a small sample of a temperate grassland biome, which would have similar features to, the prairies of the western United States, the steppes of East Asia, maybe the grasslands of Africa south of the Sahara. All of those would have similar features, and they'd all make up one biome. Or for another example, there's different species in tropical rainforests in, let's say, South America, Africa, and maybe Southeast Asia. But all those ecosystems would have similar features as well, and we could group them all as the rainforest biome. And ultimately, everything together makes up the set of all life on Earth, which we call the biosphere. So let's start by looking at a population. And right now, it doesn't matter a population of what. Individuals in a population reproduce, they make more of themselves. You might start out with, I don't know, 2 little bunny rabbits in a forest. And since bunnies do what bunnies do, you will soon have 4, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32, and then so on. There will be a fixed time within which the population doubles, and we call this exponential growth. This is modeled by an equation, and when you graph it, you get this exponential curve, sometimes called the J curve because it looks a little bit like a letter J. Do not memorize this because you don't have to memorize this for the exam. You don't have to solve the equation, but I decided to give you just a tiny taste of the mathematics behind this. That curve is defined by the equation that looks like n sub t is equal to n0 times e to the rt. What the heck? N sub t is just the population at some time, whatever time you want. That time is t. And the size of the population is equal to n0, which is the population when you start, whenever you start your observations. E is an irrational number that's a constant. It's about 2.718. And then R is a number called the intrinsic rate of increase that expresses how steeply that population is increasing. If R is equal to 0, the population is not increasing at all. If R is equal to 1, the population is increasing relatively slowly. The larger R is, the faster that population grows, the steeper that curve gets. If R is low, that curve might increase relatively slowly, and that J is going to look relatively shallow. High R means the population takes off like a rocket. So R just expresses how fast that population is able to reproduce. We'll come back to that. So there's a couple of fruit flies that are doing what fruit flies do. And the life cycle from egg to adult under ideal conditions for a pair of fruit flies will take about 7 days. And so if you have 2 fruit flies, you'll have the next generation in about 1 week, and the generation after that in 2 weeks, and so on. And if you started with 1 pair of flies and you let them breed as much as they could, and you gave them just the right temperature and all of the water and all of the food, all of the conditions that they need, and you just let them breed as much as they could, in a year you would have a ball of flies the size of planet Earth. It gets worse if you do it with bacteria. If you started with 1 E. coli bacterium and you let it divide once every 20 minutes, which is about as fast as it can do under perfect conditions, and you gave every bacterium all of the food and the perfect temperature and water and everything else that it needs, in a week, if memory serves, you would end up with more bacteria than there are atoms in the universe. Now, this can't happen in the real world. Something, and actually probably a lot of things, act to keep populations down. You can have a lot of fruit flies, especially in your kitchen if you forgot to throw away that 1 rotten banana, but you never have a ball of fruit flies the size of the Earth. And you can probably think of things that keep that population down. In the real world, you have predators like spiders. You have disease. Fruit flies can get disease. You have parasites. We've been studying some in my other class, in fact. And you also have competition. There's simply not enough food to support a ball of fruit flies the size of the Earth. So some fruit flies in any real world population don't get enough to eat and they die. Some get eaten by predators and die. Some get sick from disease. Some might not be able to find a mate for whatever reason. There could be lots of things, but through all of those ways, the population of the fruit fly can't stay in exponential growth forever. Something has to make it level off. And this applies to all species. Darwin did some back of the envelope rough calculations and worked out that if you started with 1 pair of elephants and you let them breed as much as they could, the population would grow much more slowly because pregnancy in elephants is something like 18 months. So if you start with a pair of elephants, you'll get 1 extra elephant after 18 months, which is a lot less than having hundreds of fruit flies in a week. But still, after 1,000 years, if every elephant lived its full natural lifespan and had as many babies as it could and died at the end of a long elephant life, in 1,000 years, you'd have 19 million elephants. And in 2,000 years, you'd have 20 million elephants. You'd have a 2 with 13 zeros after it number of elephants. This has never happened. There's never been 20 million elephants on Earth. There probably has never been 1 million. And with elephants, as with fruit flies, something has to act to keep that population down. Not every elephant gets to live a full lifespan and have lots of elephant babies and die old and full of days. And those factors include, there's biotic factors, which means they're living, which would be the presence of predators or parasites, the presence of prey or food sources. And abiotic factors would include things like the amount of the amount of sunlight, the temperature, levels of moisture or nutrient availability, something like that. All of those determine the maximum number of individuals in a population that an ecosystem can support. And that maximum number, please move, kitty cat. That maximum number is called the carrying capacity. So if we are talking about, let's say, the number of trees in a patch of forest, biotic factors might include the presence of, let's say, fungus that attacks wood. It might include the presence of deer that might eat tree bark in the winter that can kill a tree if that lasts too long. And abiotic factors that limit the number of trees might include the amount of sunlight. There's only so much sunlight falling on the earth per unit of area. It might include things like tornadoes, which can certainly knock over trees and kill them. It would include the amount of moisture in the ground. All of those things would limit the total number of trees in a population. And the simplest model looks like this, where populations will grow. They'll start out growing exponentially. You know, that to the left, that curve looks like that exponential curve. And then they begin leveling off. And where the population levels off, the population is still reproducing and still having babies or saplings or whatever, but the number of births balances the number of deaths. So the net size of the population no longer increases. The population is steady. This type of growth curve is called a sigmoid curve. Sigmoid means shaped like the letter S, or technically shaped like the Greek letter sigma. But you can see that that curve looks like a very widely opened out S. If you turned it about 45 degrees, it might look like the Studebaker car logo, except none of you remember what that looks like, so never mind. But that's a sigmoid curve, and that type of growth where you start exponential and then slow down and level off is called logistic growth. You could have cases where a population might increase, overshoot, and then drop back. You could have populations that will overshoot and then drop down and then overshoot again and drop down. You could have cases where the population might zigzag unpredictably a bit. There's lots of different ways this could play out. But in all of these, you'd have an exponential phase, and then the population drops back down, limited by the carrying capacity. And the reason why it's spelled with a K, by the way, is that when we use mathematical equations to describe population growth, capital K is what we use for carrying capacity. We can plug that into that equation I showed you earlier about, n sub t, the population at a time is n0 times e to the power rt. We can add a little bit of calculus to that, and we can drop in k to get an equation for that sigmoid curve. Why does this actually matter? Well, a lot of reasons. One is it's important for looking at populations that have a way of overshooting K. Locusts, related to grasshoppers, sometimes undergo these population explosions that vastly overshoot K. And what you end up with is a huge swarm of locusts seeking out more food by eating basically everything that they possibly can. So we can model and possibly prevent explosions like this. The other reason is that the same basic math can be used to model the course of epidemics. That's some data from the US Center for Disease Control showing the cumulative number of cases. Right, it's not showing people getting, it's including people who had it and then got better. The total number of cases of Ebola virus between 2014 and 2016 also followed a logistic curve, logistic equation, and you can see it makes a sigmoid curve. That ought to look really familiar right there. And in fact, that's today's US curve of cumulative COVID-19 cases. That's the total number of everyone who has gotten COVID-19, including both those who have died and those who have recovered. And we're still in a pretty exponential phase. It's only barely started leveling off. And when we talk about flattening the curve, what we mean is trying to reduce R, that rate at which the curve shoots upwards. Now, if you look into this, if you look into the math that's used to model epidemics, they actually use a slightly different number, which is called, written with a capital R. It's called R0 or R0. And it's not quite the same thing as the R we've been talking about, but it's mathematically related to it. And so, yeah, when we talk about flattening the curve, we talk about reducing R. All right. Thank you, sweetie. All right. Yes. And one of the problems that the world is facing is an upsurge in the population of pirates, of course, because pirates, as you know, have a very high R. Really? Yes, love, I went there. Mm-hmm. Right. But you could have a lot more things going on than just that, and populations can influence each other in some very complex ways. And this is a classic example. The Hudson Bay Company still operates in northern Canada, and one of the things they do is buy animal furs from trappers. And they've kept records of the furs that they buy, and their records go back over 150 years. In particular, two furs that they buy a lot of are on the left, that's Canadian lynx. It's a cat related to American bobcats. We have bobcats in Arkansas. Lynx are farther north. I think you get them in Northern Europe as well. So I'm sure you have these in your backyard, Casper. And on the right, you've got snowshoe hares, which are lynx's favorite food. Both of these get trapped and their furs brought in by trappers. And the trappers never get anything close to all of the lynxes and rabbits. And we can treat the number of furs that they bring in as a sample of how large the total population is, right? If there aren't many lynxes, then the trappers don't bring in many furs. And if there's lots of them, then the trappers will bring in more, of course. So the data looks like this. The populations of both are roughly on a about a 9 to 10 year cycle. In blue, you can see the population of snowshoe hares. And in red, you have the population of lynxes. And you can see that they're both cycle very regularly. And what's worth noting is that the lynx population is not quite in sync with the hare population. The hare population peaks, and then after that, the lynx population reaches its peak just a little bit after the hare population does. So it's not something like, climate or temperature or something like that, because that would affect both hares and lynxes equally. The reason for this pattern comes from the way that the populations interact. How do they interact? Well, it looks like this. Lynxes can eat several different things, but snowshoe hares are the lynx's main food supply. So when the hare population goes up, that means there's lots of food for the lynxes. So the lynxes get lots of food. They raise more kittens. There's more food for them. And the lynx population goes up. The lynxes can become more abundant now that there are lots of hares for them to eat. However, when the lynxes are abundant, they eat lots more hares. We'll talk about this later, but every lynx needs many hares in order to stay fed. So the hare population falls. Once the hare population falls, there's less food available for the lynxes. The lynxes don't do as well. Maybe some of them starve. They don't raise as many kittens as they used to. And over a few years, the lynx population drops. But then once you have fewer lynxes, the hare population starts increases because there are fewer predators that can eat them. So the hares breed like rabbits, as they do, and the hare population goes up. And then the cycle repeats itself. When the hare population is high, the lynxes can raise more babies and the lynx population goes up. When there's lots of lynxes, the hare population drops because they get eaten. When the hare population drops, the lynxes fall. When the lynxes fall, the hares rise, and you get these staggered cycles of population size in both the hares and the lynxes. It can be a lot more complicated than that. This happens to be a very nice case study because you really only have two species to worry about. If we were looking at Arkansas bobcats or something like that, there are more species that the bobcats could feed on than just the hares. So bobcats might feed on rabbits for part of the time, and if those become rare, they'd switch to something else. It can get much trickier than this, but this is just a really neat example of the way that populations of two different species affect each other in a very understandable way that's easy to model. All right. Populations can influence each other because one is eating the other, like lynxes eating hares. But other forms of competition can be a lot more subtle. There you can see some light streaming through the canopy of a forest. Plants in a forest don't actually go out and fight each other. These trees are not having boxing matches when you're not looking, right? Trees don't go around punching each other unless they're Ents in Lord of the Rings, I guess. But yeah, trees in this world and not Middle Earth do not go around punching out other trees. But they do, in fact, compete for access to sunlight. There's only so much energy available per unit area of the Earth's surface, and tall trees can block sunlight from reaching shorter plants. So if you are a tall tree, you can soak up all of the sunlight. If you're a shorter tree, you either have to come up with a way of growing taller than the competition, or you die out, or somehow you adapt to make do with less light. Kind of like the oaks and the maples in that song by Rush. Aaron's probably heard it. The rest of you, don't worry about it if you don't know it. But yeah, you can have competition going on even if you don't have, physical, violent competition happening. This is another example. This is one of my favorite places in the world. This is Death Valley in the middle of the Mojave Desert of Southern California and Southern Nevada. And each one of those little bushes is called creosote bush, Larea tridentata. The part of the bush above the ground might get to maybe 1 meter, 3 feet or so. These are not enormous bushes, but the roots are much, much bigger. The roots spread out for several meters around, and they are so incredibly good at getting water that any seed that falls close to a creosote bush is not going to grow for very long because the creosote bush is so good at sucking water out of that desert soil, nobody else can compete. And so in that picture, every bush is surrounded by a dead zone That dead zone is simply the area that's filled with creosote bush roots that are so good at getting water that nothing else can grow. There's areas of desert that almost look like somebody planted these. The bushes are spaced so regularly, but it's not because anybody planted them, it's because of competition between creosote bush. Last thing I'll say about carrying capacity is that it's not truly fixed. In the simple graphs that I showed you, we pretend that it is, but organisms can often modify the carrying capacity of their own environment by their own activities. One example that's not on the slide is if you look at plants growing in a rocky area, maybe bushes and small trees or even grass, they can push their roots into cracks in the rocks, and they can physically break the rocks down. Some of them can even secrete acid that will very slowly contribute to the rocks breaking up. And then, of course, when trees let their leaves fall, those leaves rot and decay. And if they mix with the broken up rock, well, broken rock plus rotten leaves equals soil. So the longer a population of plants grows in a rocky area, the more soil they're actually going to build up, and the greater the carrying capacity is going to be. Organisms can engineer their own environments like that, and this is one way they can do it. In the case of humans, new farming methods that have been introduced since the 1950s dramatically boosted the world food supply, and that boosted the carrying capacity of the human population. There had been talk before the 1950s about the world population stabilizing at 2 billion because there just wasn't enough food to support any more than that. Currently, we're up to over 7 billion, if memory serves. And a big part of the reason is that new methods of farming, new types of fertilizer, introduction of technology, tractors and things like that, improved breeds of plants and animals, the so-called green revolution of the 1950s, humans have been able to dramatically boost their own carrying capacity. The problem is that humans can also pull the carrying capacity down. One of the global problems is that because of inefficient farming methods, soil washing off of fields runs into rivers and ultimately into the ocean, and it's lost to human use. Because of farming practices like this, we've lost 10% of the world's fertile topsoil. Topsoil you can't easily replace. It takes a long time to build that up. Once you lose it, you can't grow plants as well, and your carrying capacity goes down. In many parts of the southeast United States, if you look at the soil, what you see is a lot of red clay that doesn't grow very much. My grandfather used to have a big vegetable garden, and he used to complain about the soil being absolutely terrible. The reason for that is there used to be much richer soil in many parts of the South. Plantation agriculture wasn't just bad for the slaves that made it all run at a terrible cost. It was really bad for the soil as well. And in many places, the fertile topsoil that used to cover the place has simply eroded away, and the land has never quite recovered. So farming practices like that can pull the carrying capacity down. A place where you can see that happening is the dry grassland south of the Sahara Desert. This belt extending from, now I can't remember, I think that's Eritrea, across Sudan, all the way to Mali and Mauritania. That belt of dry grassland is called the Sahel. And it's dry, but there's grass there. You can raise cows or goats, and you can make a living there. But because of overgrazing by livestock and poor irrigation, 3,900 square miles of the Sahel, I'm sorry, I should have calculated that in kilometers, becomes desert every year. That's roughly equivalent to 6 medium-sized counties in Arkansas. That's something like 1/6 of the state of Arkansas turning into desert every year. And one of the problems that is taking place there is that the carrying capacity for human populations of the countries of the Sahel, like Niger and Chad and Mali, the carrying capacity is dropping. That's colliding with the human population that's rapidly rising. And that is, setting off some very long-standing social problems in that part of the world. Okay, going to take a very short break. Everybody, y'all with me? Everybody having a good time? Any questions?
No questions.
Okay. All right. Okay, I'll start up again. Hey, kitty cat, say hi to the people. Yeah. Neko wa kawaii desu, I think. I think that's how you say that.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I haven't forgotten at all. Okay. Organisms tend to evolve towards one of two opposite, what we call life history strategies. A life history strategy is basically this. Living things don't have infinite amounts of energy. And so they have to, they don't consciously decide, but they evolve towards different ways of investing that energy. You could, if you have only a certain amount of energy in your life, you could invest it into trying to reproduce. You might invest it in trying to find food. You might have to invest some of it in getting away from predators. There's lots of different things you could spend that energy on. Just like if you only have a fixed amount of money, you have to decide how much you want to spend on shelter and how much on food and how much on video games and streaming services and whatever it is that you spend your money on. Organisms evolve to spend their energy in certain ways as well, and we call those life history strategies. The two basic types, although not the only ones, are called R-selected and K-selected life histories. They're called that because R, if you remember, is the intrinsic rate of growth. R-selected species tend to maximize that rate of increase. They may produce lots and lots of offspring, but don't invest very much energy in each one. You might have a plant that might produce many thousands of seeds, but the seeds don't contain much in the way of nutrition. The seeds aren't defended against seed-eating animals. Most of the seeds die. So you can try just reproducing as fast as you can and not investing a great deal of energy in each offspring. Or you could invest in a small number of offspring, but you invest more energy in each one. And we call that a K-selected life history. K, again, comes from that letter that we use to represent carrying capacity. Few offspring, but high parental energy investment. So a plant might produce few seeds, but provide each one of the seeds with lots of nutrients, lots of nutrition for that seedling to grow. And in a species with a K-selected life history, most of the mortality takes place among the older members, whereas in an R-selected life history, most of the mortality takes place among the younger ones. Here's examples. That's a couple of oysters. And the oysters are reproducing right now. And when oysters reproduce, they simply fire off clouds of millions of eggs and millions of sperm into the water. I think that's eggs on the left, sperm on the right. But they simply float around until they find each other and the sperm fertilize the egg. A female oyster can produce something like 100 million eggs every season. And if she's not pulled out of the water and served on the half shell with horseradish sauce, she might live for 20 years or more. So one single female oyster might produce, 2 billion offspring in her life. The overwhelming majority of them will die when they're very young. They might just never find a place to settle down and just drift until they run out of food. Many of them will get eaten by other things living in the water. Some might get attacked by bacteria. Only a tiny fraction of those, millions and millions of babies will ever get to grow into adult oysters. That's a very strong R-selected species. Humans and most mammals are generally a strongly K-selected species. We don't reproduce nearly as much as the oysters can. A human female might be able to have 15 surviving offspring. I think the Duggars, this couple in Arkansas that got on a reality TV show, I can't remember if they finished with 18 or 19, but that's about all that it's possible for a woman to have, given that pregnancy is 9 months and she's only got maybe 20, 25 years of fertility. And of course, most people don't have nearly that many kids. Reproduction is relatively low, but we invest much more energy in each offspring. It takes a great deal of maternal energy to be pregnant, right? The mother has to feed the developing embryo, and that takes energy from her. Nursing is something that all mammals do, and that takes a lot of energy. The mother has to use a lot of energy to make milk. Many mammals have some form of childcare. Ours is unusually long, but many mammals will invest energy caring for their offspring. So mammals tend to be very strongly K-selected, with humans maybe the most K-selected or among the most K-selected of all. You can have, be it said, intermediates between the two. You can have strategies that are not extremely R or extremely K. Different species have different ways of doing it. So these are kind of the ends of a scale, but you can have intermediate strategies as well. And, many birds would be strongly K-selected because the babies are born helpless and mommy has to feed them. But there's other birds that are less K-selected if the babies hatch and are able to live independently almost right away. So you can have, species can be more or less R-selected or K-selected. It's not like every species is one or the other. They're two ends of a scale, not two classes that everyone fits into. Cat, please. Nice cat. Stop licking your butt next to where I'm trying to lecture. Never had to deal with that in a classroom before. Right. If you go down to the garden store about now, ours are still open. And if you were to go look for a tree to plant, the trees all come with tags, and each tag is going to say something like grows in direct sunlight, water frequently, or grows best in indirect sunlight, fertilize the soil very well with extra calcium, or grows in partial shade, water once a week, or something like that. All of those tags that you'd see on a plant at the garden center describe what that plant species niche is. Every species has a set of conditions under which it can grow. Outside that set of conditions, it can't grow. And that set of conditions under which a species can grow is called its niche. As ecologists say, life's a niche, and then you die. Da-dum, shing. That was a joke. Right.
Terrible.
Mm-hmm. So the niche of, I don't know, I bought some tomato plants this weekend. So the niche of the tomato plant in genus Lycopersicon might be full sunlight. Tomatoes don't do that great in shade. Must have stakes to grow upwards, otherwise they'll fall over. Require such and such amount of nitrogen in the soil and such amount of calcium and such amount of phosphate. Must have such and such amount of water in the soil or they'll start to wilt. All of those characters together make up the tomato plant's niche, the set of conditions under which tomatoes can survive and reproduce. Whenever members of any two populations have niches that overlap, you have competition. When niches overlap, that means that two populations are using the same resources. And it's worthwhile when talking about competition to talk about the difference between the set of conditions under which a species is capable of growing, which is called the fundamental niche, and the set of conditions under which a species actually does grow, which is called the realized niche. So a species may be capable of growing in some areas under some conditions, but not grow there because someone else, some other species, is growing there. And I like to explain, cat, excuse me, Neko wa baka desu.
What? What do you mean to the cat?
Anyway,
Don't you cuss the cat.
I don't think baka is a cussing. I think it just means crazy.
I know. Don't you cuss the kitty.
All right. Anyway.
I got the kitty.
Okay. Be nice to the kitty. Right. When I explain this, I imagine what would happen if 20 shoe stores opened up in Valonia, Arkansas. Valonia is a small town, maybe 10, 15 miles away from Conway. There's a few thousand people in there, but that's probably, not enough people to support 20 shoe stores. So the shoe stores would be competing for access to a resource, the resource in this case being the number of people that want to buy shoes. I was kind of surprised to learn this, but apparently some people do actually wear shoes in Valonia. Who knew? But if you had 20 shoe stores all opening up in this small town, well, you'd have competition. You'd have shoe stores, trying to use the same niche, the same resource. And one of two things would happen. Either many of the shoe stores would go extinct, right? because of competition. Some of the shoe stores would not be able to attract enough customers, and they'd run out of money and they'd go bankrupt. And when this happens in biology, we call this competitive exclusion, where one species of organism may simply be so much better at using the resources of that niche that the other species in that niche may simply be driven out. That's competitive exclusion. But another possibility is what we call resource partitioning, where organisms will evolve in such a way that they minimize niche overlap. And if we're talking about the shoe stores in Valonia, many of them might go out of business because of competitive exclusion. Resource partitioning would be what happens if one shoe store starts focusing on, let's say, athletic shoes, and another shoe store focuses on work shoes, work boots and things like that. And maybe another one specializes in fancy shoes, dress shoes, and maybe another one specializes in, I don't know, cowboy boots or something like that. Does a Western store. So when that happens, you have shoe stores that are no longer competing as much because they've divided the market. I think in economics, you call this market segmentation, where each one specializes in a different kind of shoe. And people that want to buy one kind don't necessarily need to buy the other kind at the same time. So that way you have the market divided up and the stores are not competing so much. They're simply serving different parts of the market. In the same way, you can have species that will evolve in such a way that they're no longer competing in the same niche because they've divided the niche up. They're specializing in different parts of the niche. Case study from 1931, a Russian guy named Gauss took populations of two species of single-celled protist, Paramecium aurelia on the left, Paramecium caudatum on the right. These are just single cells. They're eukaryotes. I promise you there's a nucleus in there, and you can see some vacuoles and things inside. And they feed on bacteria. And when you grow them separately, both populations follow logistic growth. They'll increase exponentially and then level off once they start reaching carrying capacity. When you put them together, they're both competing for the same food supply, and one species always dominated and the other one always went down to extinction. That's some of Gauss's original data. You can see they both increase exponentially up until about day 5 or 6. And then aurelia continues to grow for a while, and caudatum begins declining after about day 8. And caudatum becomes rare and eventually, given more time, would get wiped out because Paramecium aurelia just happens to be better at using that particular niche than Paramecium caudatum. So that's a classic example of competitive exclusion. But when you look at niche partitioning, what you'll see is that species that live in the same habitat may end up sharing that habitat and creating sub-niches. This is some data from Canadian conifer forests. You've got 3 different species of birds: the Cape May warbler, the bay-breasted warbler, and the yellow-rumped warbler. They feed on insects. They live in fir trees. But they don't compete very much because each one uses different space. The Cape May warbler tends to live up at the top. The bay-breasted warbler lives farther down. And the yellow-rumped warbler lives at the bottom of the tree. They're all feeding on different species of insects. They don't really get in each other's way. There's not much competition between the two. And this would be an example of resource partitioning or niche partitioning. Similar to our shoe stores specializing in athletic footwear, cowboy boots, and Manolo Blahniks, or whatever it might be. Okay, that would seem to be that. All right, do I have any questions? All right, I will stop recording now.